Hey, welcome back to Slow Bells. Today I'm in Ludington, Michigan, which is roughly halfway down the east side of Lake Michigan. When I left my anchorage this morning, it was a nice, quiet morning. Had a great trip down here. Uh, Dropped the anchor just before lunchtime, but now it is not so nice. It's cloudy. I think it's blowing pretty good out on the lake. As a matter of fact, I am finding that the portion of the Great Loop trip down Lake Michigan has a lot in common with the portion of the Great Loop trip up the Atlantic coastline of New Jersey. I pretty much find a good place to hide until the wind settles down, and then I scamper from that place up to some other hiding place, and I end up spending a few days there until the wind dies down again. There is a lot of water on Lake Michigan, and you do not want to mess with it in this trawler when the wind is blowing. But I'm pretty cozy here, and while I'm here, I thought I would bring you up to date on where I've been so far on Lake Michigan and some of the mechanical problems along the way. Check it out. As you do the Great Loop, one of the areas you will pass through is Lake Michigan. They don't call this a Great Lake for nothing. I don't know if you can see both sides of the lake at the same time from an airplane at some high cruising altitude, but you certainly can't see across it from the deck of a boat. At my cruising speed of 7.5 knots, it would take me all day just to get across it. For an amateur boater like me driving around in a pleasure boat, there is really no practical difference between boating on Lake Michigan and boating on the Atlantic Ocean. With a fetch of 70 miles, the wind on Lake Michigan has plenty of room to build up very impressive waves that my boat is really not designed to handle, and I am certainly not designed to handle. So, just like the run up the coastline of New Jersey, I had to wait for good weather forecasts before going out on Lake Michigan. It doesn't take a lot of time for Lake Michigan to change from pleasant to miserable to dangerous. If you are doing the loop counterclockwise, which, by the way, is not the only way you can do it, you will converge on Lake Michigan from one of two possible directions. The boaters who have been exploring Canada on the Trent Severn Waterway will be coming in from the east. The boaters who pass through Buffalo, New York on the Erie Canal will be coming up from the south. In both cases, these loopers will need to pass under the Interstate 75 bridge near Mackinac City as they head toward Chicago, and then the Illinois River, and then the Mississippi River. There are two ways to get down to Chicago. Some boaters choose to cruise down the western shore of Lake Michigan, which is Wisconsin and Illinois. Others choose to cruise down the eastern side of Lake Michigan, which is mostly the state of Michigan with just a little Indiana down at the south end. This is another instance where it might be nice to do the loop more than once. You could do one shoreline one year and explore the other shoreline the next year. I chose to come down the eastern side of Lake Michigan. There are more places to stop along this shoreline, which for me meant more potential places to hide when the wind started to build. But there are marinas on both the eastern and western shorelines of Lake Michigan, so take your choice. My shipmate Bob and I ended up in Detour Village when we left Canada and re-entered the United States. There wasn't much in town, but the marina was very nice, and there was a little grocery store and a few restaurants in town. We waited out some windy weather in Detour Village for a few days, then crossed over to Mackinac City. I spent several days in Mackinac City doing an oil change, replacing my fuel filters, and changing the fluid in my two transmissions. Then we spent several more days waiting for the wind to die down on Lake Michigan. Mackinac City is a tourist town with a capital T. If you're looking for t-shirts or ice cream, Mackinac City is your kind of place. If you're looking for a big grocery store or a big hardware store, you will be disappointed in Mackinac City. There's not even a dollar store in town. I believe this is because Mackinac City is basically shuts down in the winter, waiting for the tourists to return the following summer. If you watched my previous video, you may recall that I was trying to speed up to get past some locks on the Illinois River before they shut down for maintenance for a few weeks. While I was in Mackinac City, I changed my mind and decided to slow down and enjoy the many stops on the eastern shoreline of Lake Michigan. This meant I would be passing through the Illinois River locks after they had finished with their lock maintenance work. On one of my windbound days in Mackinac City, I decided to take a tour boat over to Mackinac Island. The water was rough out in the main channel that day, and my view out the window of the tour boat was pretty much the same view you would expect from the inside of a car that was going through a car wash. If Mackinac City can be considered to be a tourist town, Mackinac Island is a tourist town on steroids. There are no motor vehicles on the island, so everything is done by either horsepower or bicycle. I rented a bicycle for a few hours and circumnavigated the island. It was a very pleasant ride. This is the appropriately named Grand Hotel on Mackinac Island. Later in the afternoon, I took the ferry back to Mackinac City for one last night in the marina. On a sunny Saturday morning, Bob and I passed under the Interstate 75 bridge that spans the Straits of Mackinac and headed over to Beaver Island. This is kind of a sleepy little island out in the middle of Lake Michigan with ferry service to the east side of Lake Michigan. The town seemed to be more of a laid-back summer home environment for someone who wants to get away from it all. It has a nice marina, and you can do a self-guided walking tour of the town, which has markers explaining the local history, and check out a few small museums there. The following day, Bob and I headed over to the east side of Lake Michigan. We were getting ready to pull into the marina in Petoskey when my port side transmission stopped working. Since Slow Bells has two engines, I was able to get the boat into the marina slip, but it wasn't one of my more graceful landings. For the benefit of those of you who are even more mechanically challenged than I am, the transmission is a big, heavy piece of equipment that fits between the diesel engine on one side and the propeller shaft on the other side. The job of my boat's transmission is very similar to the job of your car's transmission. It spins the propeller shaft one way to go forward and then spins it the other way to back up, and it doesn't spin the propeller shaft at all if you want to just sit still. I plead total ignorance when it comes to transmissions, and there was nothing at the Petoskey Municipal Marina to fix my problem. However, 4 miles away in Harbor Springs, Michigan, there were 2 different boatyards that could help me with my transmission problem. It was now Labor Day Monday, and I didn't expect anyone to be working. But just for fun, I tried calling Irish Boat Shop in Harbor Springs. Man, did I get surprised. They basically told me to come on over to their boatyard that same morning, which I did using my one good engine that was still working. By Monday evening, the yard mechanic had looked at the transmission, my boat had been picked up out of the water, and they blocked it up on dry land. By the end of Tuesday, the next day, they had used a forklift to pick up the 200-pound transmission out of the boat and lower it down to the ground. So, by Wednesday, the transmission was on its way to a transmission repair shop in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Despite the amazing service I got at the Irish Boat Shop, I was not out of the woods yet. For one thing, there was no guarantee that the shop in Kalamazoo would be able to repair my 30-year-old transmission. Another problem was the approach of winter. In Lake Michigan, marinas start turning off dock water and fuel docks sometime in mid-October. As the weather starts its gradual transition towards winter, the light wind days become less common, and the hours of daylight become shorter. If I wasn't ready to pass through the Illinois River locks when they reopened after their maintenance downtime, it could have serious long-term implications for my loop trip. Fortunately, the Irish Boat Shop had me back in the water and ready to resume my great loop trip just a couple weeks after I had limped into their yard on Labor Day. But there was just one little thing that prevented me from leaving right away. Welcome to Boating on Lake Michigan. When Lake Michigan finally gave me permission to get going, I motored back to the marina in Petoskey so I could do 3 loads of overdue laundry. I was interested to learn that the water level in the Petoskey marina could fluctuate a couple feet when a strong west wind blew big waves to the eastern shore of Lake Michigan. I finally managed to get south of Petoskey on a cloudy Monday morning. The visibility dropped in some fog and haze, and I decided to play with my radar for a bit. They say you should make it a habit to play with your radar display on a regular basis, even on good days, so when you really need it, you don't have to scramble to locate the instruction manual. Here's a picture of my chart plotter as I pass by the town of Charlevoix. Passing by Charlevoix is in itself a bit of a sin, since all the cruisers seem to enjoy stopping there. But I passed it by. The left side of the chart plotter is showing the usual electronic chart of the area. The right side of the chart plotter is showing the radar display. This is probably looking a little confusing, especially since the left side has a north-up orientation, and the right side has a direction of travel up orientation. But that's the way my convoluted brain works. On the right-hand radar screen, you can see an irregular yellow line. That yellow line is being drawn by my radar. The radar sends out a beam of energy. The energy beam hits the shoreline that I'm traveling along, and that signal is reflected back to my radar. The radar uses this data to draw a sketch of the shoreline I'm following. Here is where Slow Bells is located on both the left-hand and right-hand displays. At the time I took this picture, the Emerald Isle ferry boat was getting ready to pass in front of me on its daily run to Beaver Island. Here's how the ferry boat's location is depicted on both displays, with sort of a red triangle shape. The red triangle may be hard to see on the right side of my chart plotter display, but trust me, it's there if you look close enough. The location of that hard-to-see red triangle from the ferry boat comes to my chart plotter from AIS information that is being transmitted from the ferry boat to Slow Bells. This data is being transmitted on a VHF frequency. It has nothing to do with my radar beam. You can also see some green triangles. These are all boats with their own AIS transmitters. The only reason the ferry boat is shown in red is because it is so close to my boat. Red means, hey, this AIS target is close enough that you better be careful and not run into it. If you look closely at that red triangle on the right side of the screen, you can see just a trace of yellow. That yellow is the result of my radar beam hitting the ferry boat and bouncing back to my radar. So the radar can see the contour of the shoreline, and in the same way, it can see the location of the ferry boat out in front of me. The red triangle-shaped AIS return and the yellow, which you can see inside of the triangle, are both independently confirming the location of that ferry boat. If you now look closely at those green AIS triangles, you will notice that there is no yellow radar blip being drawn inside the green AIS triangle. That is because the radar cannot see those boats, which are most likely at some marina inside the Charlevoix harbor. Neither the radar nor my binoculars can see those boats because they are hiding behind hills and trees further inland from the shoreline. A radar beam is strictly line of sight, but the AIS signal, which is transmitted to Slow Bells on a VHF frequency, can get past those pesky hills and trees. Pretty cool, don't you think? Now, let's take a close look at that ferry boat headed over to Beaver Island. On the left side of the screen, you can see the numbers 345 displayed. What the heck is that? And on both sides of the screen, you can see a shipwreck symbol. Is that some kind of chart plotter malfunction? You know, to be perfectly honest, the first time I saw that, I thought it was a chart plotter malfunction. But the answer is that is something called the closest point of approach. To understand this concept, let's take a minute to draw a few sketches to illustrate what closest point of approach is all about. Let's say Slow Bells is poking along at its usual 7-knot speed, and let's also say that a ferry boat is passing in front of me going 14 knots, and let's say that the initial distance between our two boats is a couple miles. The distances between the two boats becomes less and less as the ferry boat passes in front of me, and eventually the distance gets down to a minimum of, let's say, 3/4 of a mile. After that, the distance between our two boats starts increasing. The point where the two boats were as close together as they were ever going to get is called the closest point of approach, sometimes abbreviated CPA. In this example, the CPA was 3/4 of a mile. So now let's go back and take another look at my chart plotter display. Remember, this picture was taken when the Emerald Isle was still getting closer and closer to Slow Bells. That strange 345 number was actually telling me that the closest point of approach was going to happen in 3 minutes and 45 seconds. And that shipwreck symbol was telling me where the ferry boat would be when we both reached our closest point of approach. I think it's pretty cool that the electronics on Slow Bells has enough data to calculate and display for me the closest point of approach with that ferry boat, or any other vessel that is sending me AIS information. I anchored that afternoon in the northwestern area of Grand Traverse Bay, not far from the town of Northport. It was a pleasant anchorage, but very exposed to the south. Fortunately, there was not a lot of wind out of the south that night. But there was a ton of fog the next morning. I was glad I had been playing with the radar the day before. With the chart plotter, radar, and AIS, I felt reasonably comfortable picking up the anchor and heading out into the fog bank. The fog eventually burnt off, and I pulled into the little town of Leland to wait out some weather. Leland's original claim to fame was commercial fishing on Lake Michigan, and there is still some of that remaining today. Mostly, though, it's more of an area for summer homes and tourists. The marina there was very nice. I eventually pulled out of Leland and was able to enjoy an unusually nice day of sunshine and light winds on Lake Michigan. Late in the afternoon, I pulled into Portage Lake and dropped anchor for the night. There was wind in the forecast once again, so I got an early start the next morning out of Portage Lake. This is what it looks like when you leave Portage Lake in the dark. Those blinking lights are the navigational lights at the beginning of the Portage Lake jetty. That morning, Slow Bells was headed this direction, and those blinking lights were located here. The sun eventually made a rather sleepy appearance. Later, I passed along the shoreline of Nordhaus Dunes wilderness area. I managed to get to my anchorage in Ludington by 10:30 that morning, well before the Lake Michigan winds got enthusiastic again. One of the things I'm enjoying the most about boating on the Great Lakes portion of the Great Loop is the amazing water clarity in the Great Lakes. I was anchored in Grand Traverse Bay a couple nights ago, and we were in 15 feet of water, and I could see the bottom of the anchorage below the boat. Today, I cannot see the bottom of the anchorage below the boat. It is 30 feet deep in this anchorage, believe it or not, here in Ludington. And I am using every inch of my 200 feet of anchor line to keep Slow Bells in one spot for the next couple days, until eventually the wind dies down again and I can scamper off to my next hiding place. And I guess future scampering will be taking me closer and closer to Chicago. That will be the subject of the next video, assuming I can avoid any other major mechanical breakdowns between now and then. Hope so. Later.